Today we're going to work on dividing fractions and mixed numbers, and the steps for this are really pretty simple. There's more than one way you can do it, and you may have learned it a different way before, but the method we're going to use today is a method that requires us to find a common denominator. So let's take a quick look at the steps. First step is to write all of your numbers in fraction form. Second step, that's where we find our common denominator. And then the third step is to simply divide the numerators. And that is going to be your answer. Once you divide the numerators, that's going to be your answer. You might have to simplify it or change it to a mixed number, but when you divide the numerators, that'll be your answer. So let's take a quick look at this. So our first problem, 4 3/4 divided by 5/8. Step 1 is to change everything to fraction form. So 4 3/4 is going to be 19/4. And remember how we get that. 4 times 4 is 19 plus, or is 16 rather, plus 3 is 19. So that's where we get the 19 from. And then our 4 comes from our denominator of 4. So 19/4 divided by 5/8. We've done step 1. Step 2 is to find a common denominator. So our common denominator here is going to be a number, or it has to be a number that both 4 and 8 go into. The easiest one to do is 8. You could do 16 or 24 or so forth and so on, but 8's the smallest common denominator, the least common denominator, so that's the one I would use if I could. So I need to make both of these into 8s. The 5/8 is already 8s, so I'm going to leave it 5/8. For the 19/4, I have to say, okay, 4 times what is 8? It's 4 times 2, so then I have to do 19 times 2. And if I'm not sure what that is, I simply come over to the side and work it out. 2 times 9 is 18, carry the 1. 2 times 1 is 2, plus 1 is 3. So that gives me 38. I get 38/8 divided by 5/8. So I've now completed step 2. Step 3 is to simply divide the numerators. So my numerators are 38 and 5. So it truly means to do 38 divided by 5, and that's going to be your answer. So this is going to say 38/5 means 38 divided by 5. So that's my answer. And again, it comes from my numerator, my first numerator divided by my second numerator. Some people are not quite sure because we're not using that denominator, that 8. That's totally okay. We don't need to use the 8. And I'll kind of talk about that in a little bit why we're not using it, but we don't need it. So we get 38/5, and then we can change that to a mixed number. 5 goes into 38 7 whole times with 3 left over. So we get 7 3/5. Our denominator is 5 because our denominator here was 5. So our answer, 4 3/4 divided by 5/8, is 7 3/5. Now, this process relates back to some of the modeling we've done, and we could actually show this and prove why this works using a model. For example, if an average animated movie lasts 1 1/2 hours, how many animated movies could you watch in 6 hours? So to do that, we would need to do 6 divided by 1 1/2. And the reason we need to do that is because we need to take the whole time we're watching movies, which is the 6 hours, and split it into parts that are each 1 1/2 hours, because that would represent, each of those 1 1/2 hours would represent one movie. Now, if we wanted to work this out using a model, the first thing we would have to do is we would have to draw 6 holes. So let's start by drawing our 6 holes. And each hole is going to represent 1 whole hour. And then we need to split our 6 whole hours into parts that are each 1 1/2 hours. Well, to make that easier, we want to split each of our hours into halves. That's going to make it easier. Now, I want to point something out to you. If we were to follow the steps that we've been talking about, we would have rewritten this problem as 6/1 divided by 3/2. And notice, if we find a common denominator, in this case, it would be 2, because 1 and 2 both go into 2. So we'd have to multiply 6 and 1 both by 2 to give us 12/2 divided by 3/2. If you notice the problem that we're getting ready to model here, that makes sense Because if you look at our model, right now our model has 12 pieces and each piece is a half. So that's our 12 halves, and what we want to figure out is how many groups of 3 halves are going to fit into that. Now based on our steps we've talked about, the next thing we would do is 12 divided by 3. So 12 divided by 3, which equals 4. Well, notice that's really exactly what we're doing with our model also, because we're seeing how many groups of 3 halves we can fit in the 12 halves. So we've got 1, 2 groups of 3 halves, 3 groups of 3 halves, and then a 4th group of 3 halves. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. So 3 halves goes into 12 halves 4 times, or in other words, 6 divided by 1 1/2 is 4. So that model, again, and the steps that we're talking about tie perfectly together. And I could do a model for any one of these problems, but the model does take a while. That's the disadvantage of doing it. So that's why sometimes it's easier to know what the steps are that would show that would do what the model is showing. So let's look at another example. 3/4 divided by 9. Again, I have to write my numbers in fraction form. So I'm going to get 3/4 divided by 9 over 1. And when I do that, I need to now find a common denominator. My easiest common denominator is going to be 4. So let's make these fourths. 3/4 is already 3/4. I can multiply both the 1 and the 9 by 4 to give me fourths there. So I'm going to get 36/4. So 3/6 divided by 36/4. To do that, I really just need to, again, divide my numerators, making sure that I divide them in the order they're written. So my answer is 3/36, which can be simplified to 1/12 by dividing both numerator and denominator by 3. So my answer to that one is 1/12. Now I told you all that this whole thing about the denominators, this idea that you don't necessarily need to do anything with the denominators once you find a common denominator. The reason for that is because just like when you multiply straight across. With division, technically you can divide straight across. Notice what's going to happen if I were to take this problem and do it as division, dividing straight across. My division would give me 3/36 over 4 divided by 4. Well, 4 divided by 4 is 1. And anything over 1 is just the number. So that's why it still equals 3/36. And the same thing for my previous example. Once I got it to be a common denominator, 38/8 divided by 5/8. 38/5 means 38 divided by 5, and then I would put that over 8 divided by 8, which 8 divided by 8 is 1. So 38/5 over 1 equals 38/5, which is exactly what we had up here. So it's not that we're not using those denominators necessarily, it's just that we're not writing it down because there's really no need to, because they essentially are canceling each other out. All right, I'm going to give you 2 more problems that I want you to try. So you're going to try these 2 and then see if you get them correct. All right, so now try these. Pause while you try them, and then once you've tried them, go ahead and hit play and see if you have them correct. All right, so for the first one, that one was actually really simple because your denominators were already the same, so you just ended up with 13/4 divided by 11/4, which gives you 13/11 or 1 2/11. For the second one, your numbers ended up a little bit bigger because your denominator had to be fairly big, but you still can follow the steps, find a common denominator, and once you work that out, you should get 1 17/25.